Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is James.
And my name is Matt.
And on today's episode of the podcast, we are looking at time travel horror. So we've got a couple of films, but these couple of films are going to turn into a few more than that, because I think in order to talk about the films we're looking at today, they've got sequels, they've got lots of stuff going on in them. So we're talking about a lot in today's episode, aren't we, Matt?
Yeah, it's a bit of a busy one, and we're going to keep a steady hand on the tiller, right, and keep things firm, I guess.
Definitely. But the main films we are looking at today are Happy Death Day to You from 2019, and we're also going to be looking at The Endless from 2017. Both heavy on the time travel, these two, but they've got sort of roots in horror as well. And in order to chat about the horror aspects of them, we've got a very special guest today, haven't we, Matt?
Yes, our favourite horror expert, the master of horror podcasting, is Mike Munzer.
Hello, thanks for having me again. I'm excited to be here.
Thanks very much for joining us. We need your expertise once again to figure out the intersection between horror and sci-fi and work out what the hell's going on in both of these films.
Yeah, that's fair. There's a lot to unpick. I'm going to have a lot of questions for you guys as well, I think. So it should be an interesting one.
So Mike, just before we get started, tell us a little bit more about yourself, just in case any listeners of the show haven't come across you and your podcast before.
So I have a podcast that's like very similar to yours in its structure, but it's all about horror films. So it is looking at the whole history of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres, one series at a time. So we did a whole series of discussions on slasher movies. We've done a whole series on folk horror. I don't have a regular co-host. I have different people joining me every week. You guys have joined me for an episode on this particular series to talk about The Fly, which has been really exciting because the current series we're on is body horror. So that's been great. So it's, very similar to this podcast. It's a really fun, in-depth exploration of the horror genre and what makes it so great.
Definitely. And if you like your sort of deep dive film podcasts, Evolution of Horror is highly recommended by us. And to be fair, it's the inspiration for this podcast as well. So everybody thank Mike for that one.
Us especially.
So Mike, what are some of your favourite time travel films? Like, what kind of films have really stuck with you from the sort of subgenre of time travel?
I would say, outside of the horror genre, pretty much my favourite film of my whole life is Back to the Future. It's like my favourite film. And actually I do have, it's like a bit of a weakness for time travel, I think. Anytime any film dabbles in time travel, I'm immediately interested in it because I think it's just such a fun storytelling technique, I think. As I'm sure you guys are finding, some films are better at sort of using time travel than others, and there are always elements of time travel that you can pick holes in if you really want to. But it's a really fun idea, isn't it? It's just a really fun kind of fantasy idea of what if you could go back in time and change this or do this, or what if you could look into the future. It's just always going to be exciting and entertaining and intriguing. So I love time travel, and I think some of my favorite sci-fi films, like Back to the Future, Looper, I've got like a lot of my favorite sci-fi films are probably time travel. So I'm a big fan of this area, this subgenre.
What are your favorite different types of time travel and the little niches that time travel films occupy? You said Back to the Future is your favorite. So are you a time machine kind of guy?
I guess I am. Yeah. How would you classify Back to the Future? That's a time machine. And I guess what is that different to like multiverse type time travel? Is that what you mean, like the different types?
Well, you can have your time loops. You can have a bonk on the head, as we've learnt. Time machines tend to be a big way of doing it, but they come in many different forms. And we looked at Back to the Future in the context of Doc as like a mad scientist inventor and the relationship between the inventor and the machine that he's created. So we talked about that with the 1960 adaptation of The Time Machine, the H.G. Wells story.
Yeah, no, I think I do. I love all of it. I suppose time loop films, sometimes they can be slightly frustrating, the kind of Groundhog Day model. I know that film is so beloved to so many people. I sometimes find those films a little bit more frustrating in some ways. I guess because of the repetitive nature maybe of the storytelling itself. I think I prefer those kind of real puzzle box stories where you're trying desperately to kind of figure it all out and slot it all together. Ones that sort of challenge me a bit. Primer actually is I'm a huge fan of Primer. And even, I know you guys have covered this on another series, but movies like Interstellar and things that kind of deal with time and space and that sort of thing as well. I love that sort of stuff. When it comes to TV as well, I've just been rewatching Lost for the first time since, God knows, about 10 years ago. And still my favorite season of Lost is season 5, which is the one that it's suddenly where Lost becomes a time travel show, basically. So yeah, I have got a bit of a weakness for that. I love it.
I almost forgot there was time travel in Lost until you brought that up. And season 5 was my favorite as well.
So good. It's so good. And and I really, I don't want to go off on a Lost tangent, but I do think in some ways it's kind of clever. A lot of people talked about how all of a sudden it became a time travel show out of nowhere. But if you think of the fact that the format from the beginning is that it jumps back and forward, the show jumps us flashbacks, then flash forward. And then all that happens is in series 5, the characters themselves are jumping forward and jumping back. And I think it's kind of a fun and quite clever sort of evolution of that show in a way.
Well, that's what we've seen a lot in the time travel films we've looked at. There's most time travel stories tell a very personal tale. It's about the character's history, and you have to have some sort of background to understand their history to get all the time travel points. Like when they're jumping back, it's a very personal experience for these people. And because time travel is so linked to memory, having like flashbacks and things like that in Lost are sort of like the perfect device in order to make the time travel interesting when it comes in later on. But on sort of like time travel and different things you sort of enjoyed watching, where do you think the sort of like the horror elements come in with time travel? Because it can be quite a scary idea, can't it?
Yeah, it can. And I think, I know that we sort of talked about different films that we could talk about, and I was having a think about what horror films deal with time travel. And of course, there are films like the Terminator films, and of course, you've got things like Evil Dead 3, Army of Darkness, where Ash is sent back in time. But I don't know whether necessarily they are, of course, horror films and sci-fi films that deal with time travel, but I'm not sure whether the time travel itself is producing the horror in films like that in a way. Whereas I think particularly with the films we're going to talk about today, there is something very horrific, or there can potentially be something very horrific about the idea of being stuck in time in some way, whether you're stuck in a loop or whether you're stuck in a time that isn't your own, and the dangers that time travel could potentially cause. It can cause death, it can cause destruction, it could cause the destruction of the entire universe, I suppose, in some ways. So I think there is a lot of peril, just like when we talked about space and how in some ways space is filled with horrors because of how much peril there is. I guess it's the same with time travel in a lot of ways. And time travel itself in horror can just be a bit of a device. Like Ash being sent back in time is a great way to just have Ash fight knights and all these other things. But if you use the actual concept of time travel to actually enhance the horror, which I think the films that we're talking about today are, I think that's really effective because it can be something really scary.
Yeah, and I suppose that all links in with your Mind and Body series that you're doing at the moment, like specifically the mind, the psychological aspects of time travel and how that horror's in there with these kind of films.
Definitely. I mean, again, I drone on way too much about the director, David Lynch, but there is an element of time jumping and chronology sort of going wrong, and even literal time travel potentially in some of the stuff he does, although he never makes it completely clear. And I think it does certainly link in with the idea of memory and madness and fractured memories and resetting memories and rewriting things, and all of that kind of stuff can be used to create a real sense of dread and the uncanny and all of those things that make great horror. So yeah, I think it definitely links in with a sort of psychological aspect as well, yeah.
Thank you for mentioning David Lynch, of course, the director of Dune. Always happy to hear about and think about Dune. Anyway, I do think that there is a lot of potential for horror in time travel films, like you said, but it's so rare that it's the focus and it's dwelled on. So I think it's going to be interesting to look at these films that really do take that aspect. Because even in, I remember when we looked at Back to the Future and the idea of creating an alternate timeline and trying to reconcile in your mind that like your family has completely changed into different people, but that's at the end of Back to the Future and it's just not like a point. And they get into that in Back to the Future too. But the sheer horror of like making a change to your world through time travel is often not dwelled on. That's not what they're doing in these films, but there is a lot of that potential in time travel to introduce these horror elements that most time travel films don't go for and just kind of breeze over because that's not the story they're telling.
Yeah, I would say that Back to the Future 2, when I was a kid, that really frightened me, that sort of middle section when he returns to what he thought was his present day and everything's changed and his father's dead and there's all of that really horrific stuff going on. And it's like waking up in a nightmare, isn't it? And of course, that's not a horror film, but there is an element of that shows you the horrors of time travel, I suppose, in a really effective way.
So let's get into the two horror sci-fi films that we're talking about today. So let's look at Happy Death Day to You then.
I was stuck reliving the same day over and over again until someone wearing a baby mask murdered me on the night of my birthday. Turns out it was my roommate Lori. I kicked her crazy ass out a window and killed her, which broke the loop. But now I'm living the better version of my life.
I think in order to understand this one, we have to first talk about the first one and why that worked. So, Mike, would you be happy to do a quick rundown of Happy Death Day and how that film sort of worked?
Yeah, in a nutshell, it's actually a really lovely, simple story because it was this low-budget film made by Blumhouse, and it's kind of Groundhog Day meets a slasher movie in a way. So it is a girl wakes up on her birthday, she's in college, she's this kind of very shallow, vacuous sort of sorority girl, quite stereotypical kind of mean girl, I suppose. She is killed by a man in a mask with a knife, and then she wakes up and it's the same day again. And it keeps happening to her over and over and over again. And she has to find a way to survive and stop this never-ending loop that she's in. And whilst doing that, she kind of has to realize that she has to become a better person and kind of work through some of her own emotional hurdles in order to get through this narrative. And in a way, the time travel aspect isn't really explained. It's just kind of matter of fact, she is in a loop, and it's much more a kind of fun teen slasher film than anything else, isn't it? And it ends, spoiler alert, with her breaking that loop and kind of living happily ever after, or so we thought.
So I watched both of these films because I'd never heard of any of them. So I watched both of them in preparation for this, and I really enjoyed the first one, and I was really quite surprised that there was a sequel, and I thought it was a weird film to make a sequel to without, and I didn't understand how you could do that without just retreading it, new cast, same thing happens to someone else kind of thing. And I thought that was a weird choice, but I then did a little bit of reading on Blumhouse. I don't really know anything about Blumhouse, but I think sequelizing and franchising things is kind of what they do. I've seen loads of their films, but I've never seen any of the sequels to their films, so I don't know that aspect or what their deal is. And as that's a whole horror thing, Mike, I was wondering if you could kind of fill us in on them and him, Mr. Bloom.
Yeah, he's actually a really interesting guy, Jason Blum. So I've actually had him on my podcast before, and he's a producer. He runs this production company called Blumhouse, and essentially they have a sort of mantra. They have a model where he will offer sort of fairly new and young filmmakers and writers. They usually have to do both. They usually have to be writer-directors. And he will essentially fund their project, and he will give them a maximum budget of, I believe, $5 million. So very sort of small budget relatively. And for that small budget, they will have complete creative control, essentially. So what you have with Blumhouse is a whole bunch of really interesting new voices, new filmmakers and writers who are making the project they wanted to make under a kind of small budget. And you know, there are some bad ones, there are some great ones, and Jason Blum's sort of thing is that what other studios spend to make one film, I can spend to make 20 films and hire 20 new writers or interesting writers and directors and let them make their projects happen, essentially. So there's a load of horror films that have become hugely successful. Probably the biggest one that's come from Blumhouse is Get Out, Jordan Peele's Get Out, which of course even won an Oscar as for Best Original Screenplay. So that really kind of pushed them over into something big, like a big recognizable studio, I think. But they've done a whole bunch of other very well-known horror properties. They kind of really shot to fame with the Paranormal Activity series. Again, that kind of low budget, high return kind of model. And they made, films like the Insidious films, Sinister, The Purge was really, really successful as well. And the recent Halloween remake as well. They did a new Halloween, which is I think the 10th one in the series, which was one of the better Halloween sequels as well. It kind of forgot everything that came before it, and it just continued on from the very first film. And they got Jamie Lee Curtis back, and it kind of stripped that franchise back to basics. And again, I think that's another Blumhouse thing. It's a simple concept. It's kind of back to basics. It's a high concept ideas done on a low budget, I suppose.
So we covered a Blumhouse film when we looked at Upgrade, and I think a lot of the Blumhouse stuff, they do have like that sci-fi horror sort of like tinge to them as well, because you've got The Invisible Man, which was one of their most successful recent releases. And that is like, it's a sci-fi story. And even when you look at Get Out, has a lot of science fiction elements in it. I mean, the whole idea of switching bodies, that's a very sci-fi sort of like trope.
Definitely.
Yes, it's quite interesting that they work so well together in these. And if you're looking at sort of like low budget independent things, a lot of sci-fi films that we've looked at in the past, the ones which really thrive and we've enjoyed the most are the lower budget ones which are a bit more cerebral, you have to kind of figure out. And it's interesting seeing this link between sci-fi and horror here, with those sort of like, the standout ones are quite often the simple ideas which turn out to be something more.
Totally, yeah. And I think what's really kind of nice about them is that they've suddenly, they've it's not often these days where you have a movie studio that is a brand, like 20th Century Fox or Warner Brothers, for example, or Disney. They can be so many things now. They don't really have a specific sort of personality or brand. Whereas Blumhouse feels a little bit more like, in horror terms, the Universal films of the 1930s or Hammer in the 1950s, where it's like a studio has a kind of recognizable style. A studio is in a way a kind of stamp of creative approval, almost, in a way. Like me as a horror fan, I will always go and see the next Blumhouse film because I quite enjoy watching films that are low budget but good on ideas and that kind of thing, And
speaking of those ideas, like, the whole idea of getting a sequel for Happy Death Day and the way they've done it is really clever, because they've essentially taken what is a simple horror version of Groundhog Day, like we said, turned it into a slasher, and then they've added this extra bit in the sequel where it's like, instead of just having the time travel be sort of like we've experienced before, like a bonk on the head, it's unexplained, it's about the character's personal journey, and then that's what resolves the time loop. They go one step further and they go, actually, it's all an experiment, and this experiment has caused all this timey-wimey shit to happen.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this sequel then. So what kind of time travel is happening in this? Because there's quite a few different bits going on.
Yeah, the plot of this movie is somewhat confusing considering the plot of the first movie is very, very straightforward, isn't it? So we've got Ryan, who is a one-note character in the first film, who I think Ryan literally only appears at the door of the dorm when he bursts in at the start of every loop
and says his fine vagina line and then goes away.
Which every time I watched it, I had it with subtitles on at one point. I didn't know what he was saying until I had the subtitles on, because he just mumbles his way bursting into the room, but it kind of becomes a point that she picks up on later. Anyway, it turns out he's studying quantum mechanics at the university that they're attending and has built this massive time machine, or what's the purpose of the machine that they're creating together?
They're trying to slow time, aren't they? They're trying to do experiments to see if they can slow down time, but instead of slowing it down, they've started this whole weird time loop.
So Ryan starts experiencing that, and I did really like the way this film really gets into its first time loop very quickly, because that had all been established in the first film. And it was something I quite actually enjoyed in the first film. When you know that it's going to be a time loop movie, the things that happens to Tree when she's walking out of the dorm the first time, it's just like noticeable things happen. Someone leans in and stares at her, and you know it's going to be like, oh, these are the time loop cues that she's going to pick up on. And they jump straight into that with Ryan. He gets out of his car and like 6 things happen to him, and he's murdered and jumps back to the start within 5-10 minutes at the start of the film. I thought that was quite well done. It was quite fun, very economical, and just kind of gets you into the new story very quickly, because that's not what this film's going to be about. So there's no point spending a lot of time building up into this repeating loop for Ryan. And then it just kind of goes completely off the rails and in about 100 different directions at once, right?
Yeah. So like even just trying to figure it out now, I'm struggling to try and think of all the different things that happen. So you start off and, like you said, Ryan's in a time loop. Then you find out there's another killer who kills Ryan. Turns out this other killer is Ryan from a different universe, like a multiverse. Never gets resolved. So he's just popped up, tries to kill Ryan. Then the machine goes off again. And then Tree suddenly finds herself in a parallel universe, a different reality. So this like is where all the fun happens, because you could do the same film essentially, but things are slightly off kilter. So you can do all this sort of like extra layer of stuff. How did you find that, Mike? Like in terms of having watched the first one and then going into this one, and sort of like what did that add to the film for you, or did it add anything for you?
Well, it's really tricky, isn't it? Like you said, Matt, at the beginning, you know, in a way, that first one works so well as its own little thing. Did it really need a sequel? Did it really need expanding? Did we really need it all explained as to why she was in a time loop? But I remember going along to the cinema to watch the second one, and I, like you, I was quite excited by the setup of how the second one begins, that it's almost that kind of Rashomon thing where we're going to almost see the same story again, but from a different perspective. And we're going to see this one character that was so minor in the first one. It's going to expand that world and actually show how he was responsible for it. I did think that was a really cool idea, and I really liked where it started off. But I think exactly as you guys say, it kind of unravels a bit, and I think it loses some momentum. And I think it sort of drowns in its own science and kind of time travel mythology in a way. It's kind of dealing with multiverses, but also time loops and all of these other things. And it's kind of cramming everything into this one peppy teen movie. And also, just as a horror fan, the sad thing as well for me is that it feels like it somewhere along the way stopped being a horror film too, didn't it? It went from a sort of slasher film, which the first one was, into just full-blown teen movie sci-fi, I suppose, which is okay, but it's not what I was expecting, having seen the first one, you know?
Yeah, what I really wanted to happen, which didn't happen, is I wanted them to make more of the doubles. Like when I went in to watch the film, I thought, okay, so maybe they're just going to keep ending up killing themselves, and then there's this army of duplicates, but that never comes to pass. But that was like my idea of what was going to happen. Everyone in these baby masks, and it turns out they're all them in all these different scenarios. But
that would have been cool.
Yeah, that would have been good. But no, we've just got Tree going around a slightly different version. And like you say, it is like a teen comedy more, this one.
You know, I think Tree is a really fun character. And I think in some ways what this film does is the classic sequel thing, where it's kind of like what you liked about the first one, but more. And a lot of people had a very positive reaction to Jessica Roth, who played Tree. She's brilliant. And I think she's like I say, she's incredible. She's a really great comedy actress. She's got brilliant comic timing, but she also has a lot of heart. And that first film actually did have quite a lot of heart as well, about this girl who had lost her mother and, you know, kind of finding kindness in her heart by the end of it and everything as well. And there's a lot of stuff there going on that then they kind of throw more into, you know, in the second one, I think. And it really does become this story about Tree and her mother, and in like, to use more of a crude word, it just becomes much more schmaltzy in a way, doesn't it? It becomes much more soppy. And again, you know, if you were wanting to watch a kind of teen slasher movie, you would be a bit disappointed, I think, with this film, wouldn't you? And if you wanted to watch a kind of sci-fi time travel film, I don't know whether this would necessarily do it for you either. I'm not sure. I mean, it has lots of stuff going on, but
it goes across a lot of different ways. I was interested when I was watching it, thinking like how much of a disappointment it would have been to horror fans when it came out, because it goes way away from the horror, and like you said, it becomes a comedy. There's like kind of a heist movie element towards the end where they have to break in and steal the time machine back
from the crazy Dean who's like stolen it away. Very sort of teen movie.
Yeah, but then God, he's a ridiculous. He's like the Dean out of The Simpsons. Oh no, he was like a cool, chilled out guy, wasn't he? Anyway, it does swing back into the horror stuff in an interesting way, because I was thinking about that. I was watching it. It was like a comedy teen movie with the love triangle plot going on, but then it suddenly jumps back when she goes into the hospital again, and both films have this moment where she's admitted into hospital that's really important for like the ticking clock kind of scenario for the time travel. Things have to end because otherwise she's going to die anyway. Then it did go back into that kind of stalking around the hospital, and there's a slasher in the hospital. We had a few moments where we went back into that. So they didn't completely lose sight of that slasher movie tone. It's just they were bouncing off the walls trying to do 3 or 4 different things at once, and there wasn't always time on screen to be a horror movie.
Yeah, I agree. And but do you know what as well, the one thing I thought about, because this is like we said, it's a slasher film, and we talked about slasher films a lot on my podcast, that almost it's a kind of, until Happy Death Day, it was almost a bit of a dead subgenre. It was huge in the 80s, huge in the 90s with films like Scream, and then it just kind of fizzled away, and they kind of have disappeared off the radar for the last 10 or 15 years. And I think the one thing about slasher movies that's always been true is that they're aimed at teenagers, and actually often teenage girls. Like, they are often about teenage girls at the center of them, who are the heroines, who kind of best the killer at the end. And part of me was thinking, okay, maybe this film isn't my favorite, but maybe it's not for me as well. Like, there's probably a huge audience out there of teenagers and teenage girls too, who probably would have had a blast watching this at the cinema with their friends on a Friday night as well. And I think it maybe doesn't push the horror as much as I would like, but also there's probably so much to enjoy in this film as well, because it is really fun, and she's still brilliant in this film. I particularly love the montage of her committing suicide over and over again. Like, there's some really funny moments like that, which I really enjoyed.
So I was thinking about that bit in particular, because that would be where the horror stuff would come in. That's what came in the original one. It's when she keeps being killed over and over again, which is a horrifying idea. But in order to sort of like make it cater for that teen audience in this one, and when they're switching it to she has to kill herself over and over again, they could do that in a very dark way, but they do it in sort of like all the like weird fun ways, like Groundhog Day, when he's sort of like he puts the toaster in the bath, and that's what she does basically. She electrocutes herself, and it gets more and more elaborate, and it's quite fun. Like there's the tree surgeon bit where she's putting herself in that machine, and that's got like a reference to Back to the Future, because I think it's Biff's Tree Surgeon Company or something. There's some sort of Biff reference in there. And obviously there's sort of like the joke in Back to the Future is why don't you make like a tree and get out of here?
Of course, yeah.
So they're referencing that, little bits like that. But the best one is obviously the skydiving scene, right?
It's the friend's reaction as well when she lands in front of them. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it is really funny. And I think you're right. Like, at that moment where we've got a montage of deaths, but it's kind of set to a sort of teen poppy music, and it's done as this really fun, glossy, silly montage. It's like, okay, this is the film that we're in. It's not a horror film anymore, but it is still quite fun, to be fair.
But again, it's another example of where there's an opportunity for so much more horror that hasn't been picked up on in a time travel film. Definitely at that point, I was thinking specifically when she kills herself by throwing herself out of a plane and somehow manages to land herself right in front of Danielle, her love rival, and Carter, the guy that she likes. This film was talking about like alternate realities, and there was a possibility to go into like what happens to the people in that timeline, or if it is an alternate timeline rather than a time loop, what happens to Carter and Danielle in the world where one of their best friends like exploded in a puddle of blood in front of them, but they were playing it for laughs. There was just no opportunity to do that. But it was an unexplored route in the film they could have gone down.
I was thinking that exact same thing. I was like, because there's a Rick and Morty episode where Morty keeps getting killed over and over again. He thinks he's resetting time, but he's not. He's just killing the Morty in a different reality. And that's what I kept thinking about in this. And also, what happened to the original tree? Because there's one bit when Ryan says, okay, so you're replacing the tree in this reality and the other one's gone to your reality or something like that. So what's going on there? Like, there's lots of unanswered questions in this film.
Yeah, that idea that suddenly she's shifted into another reality, so the tree that was in that reality has shifted into a different one, and it's almost like, and I guess this is the thing with time travel sometimes as well, isn't it? Where it's almost like, do you know what? Don't bother yourself even thinking about that. There is even a joke in Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me. I don't know if you remember, where he time travels and he's like, hang on, Basil, if I go back to blah, 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 then hang on. And Basil goes, I suggest you just don't worry about that and enjoy it. And then he looks down the camera lens and he goes, and that goes for you all too. And I think like there is that element of time travel films, isn't there, sometimes where it's like, do you know what? If you think about it too much, you're just going to tie yourself in knots kind of thing.
Wait a tick. Basil, if I travel back to 1969 and I was frozen in 1967, presumably I could go visit my frozen self. But if I'm still frozen in 1967, how could I have been unthawed in the 90s and traveled back to, oh no, I've gone cross-eyed?
But the problem with time travel sequels is that they are inherently inviting the audience to continue thinking about the premise and thinking about the premise in more detail. It's so hard to make sequels. I think Back to the Future is so good as a trilogy. I think some people slag off the third one, but particularly the first two, they let it get more and more complicated, but it improves the series. Certainly, like after Terminator 2, for example, the time travel stuff gets brought in more and more in some of those sequels, and it's never to the benefit of those films to get more involved in the time travel elements and the paradoxes and all of that. It's opening a door that is an incredibly dangerous thing to do storytelling-wise.
Because time travel is surely the easiest way of franchising stuff and doing sequels, because you've got an audience already who watched the first film, and then you can go back and be like, it's the first film, but you need to have this knowledge of that film in order to watch this film. And then it's kind of like, and it's got the Easter eggs of stuff like, if you've seen this, you'll know this and you'll know this funny bit. So I think that's another thing that's happened recently in time travel films, like this idea that you can retread the same sort of stories and you're sort of like inviting the audience to go along with you on the ride, but they have to have that prior knowledge from watching the other sequels in order to really get it. And then you're suddenly sort of in this rabbit hole of trying to figure it all out and just trying to like find out where they've gone wrong or where they've gone right. And yeah, because I've just finished watching Dark, which I think we'll cover on the podcast at some point. But that is definitely one example of like, your mind will constantly think about all the different things going on and it'll take you through like 100 different rabbit holes. But that's part of the joy of time travel as well at the same time, because you're constantly thinking about what's going on and what is the problem. Like the puzzle box thing you talked about at the start, Mike, it's exactly that.
Yeah, I do love it. I love fiction that makes me think about it in that way. I know you guys talked about Devs, didn't you, on your podcast? And that is a show that I loved. And I don't know whether it's strictly time travel, but there certainly is a multiverse element, right? Isn't there, to that? And I do love when sci-fi like that is done well and well thought out, just thinking it over in my head and of all the possibilities, you know?
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting, when you start to think about the possibilities, like you said, it makes you question why the filmmakers chose the specific narrative that they have, because they obviously, when you're writing a film like that with multiple dimensions and multiple timelines, you have all of those options at play and you have to navigate what's best for your characters or best for your the story that you're trying to tell, and then they have to close off all of those doors one by one and say, well, let's not do it like that, let's not do it like that, let's not do it like that, and just get them to where they need to be. And I do actually think that works very, very well in Happy Death Day to You. You were saying, Mike, that it picks up, well, what did you like about the first film? And this film then picks up some of that and just does more of it, because that's basically what sequels usually do. The thing that really hooked it for me in particular, we already talked about Jessica Roth and how good she is. It's the sense of like character development within a time loop movie that is very, very good in the first film. I did really think they did a great job of it in this one. They ramp it up by bringing her mother back to life, and then she has to make a choice between, you know, this boy that she likes or having her mother back, which seems like a no-brainer, and she treats it like a no-brainer at first, but then through the film and understanding herself and coming to this realization that the person she is the person who sadly lost her mother, and what that means, it's like this extra level of character development that she's forced to go through in 2 days, I guess. I mean, it's longer for her, but in plotline 2 days.
And that's a really fun, poppy way of exploring that kind of quite interesting psychological conundrum of, you know, would you choose to step into another version of your own life that was like the picture perfect version of your life, but you knew that it wasn't real, or that you knew that it was in some way not yours? So that this idea that Tree can go into this alternate reality where she has her mum, but all of her memories aren't there and they're kind of fake, they're not really her memories, and ultimately is that still more unsatisfying than living in your own life, living your own world kind of thing? So I think it is juggling some quite interesting ideas there.
I thought it was really well done in both films. I think we were being a little bit down on Happy Death Day to You earlier, in just as we were talking before. I should clarify that I actually really, really enjoyed it. It's kind of a mess, but
it's a fun
Mike,
mess.
you were talking. Yeah, it is a fun mess. And Mike, you were talking about it being schmaltzy. I have to say, I'm a real sucker for schmaltz when it's done well. And when Tree and Carter kiss at the end of this film, guys, I was moved.
You got a little dusty in the room all of a sudden. No, you're right. Like, I agree with you in that I didn't want to sound too down on it, in that I did really enjoy it as well. But I do think that when I try and use my objective brain, sometimes I think, like you said, it's a bit of a mess, but it is still a really fun, enjoyable mess. Like, I do really enjoy it as well, yeah.
Do you think it's a mess because they're already thinking about another one? Because this, I think they initially thought about doing a trilogy, and I think that's what Christopher Landon said initially. I don't know if it's in development. There's been like lots of rumors about it not being, and then suddenly it is.
Well, when I spoke to Jason, I asked him, because when I spoke to Jason Blum, because I asked him about, what's going on with Happy Death Day? And he said, well, no, he said, it's been axed because not enough people went to see Happy Death Day 2. So Happy Death Day was huge. Happy Death Day 2 You bombed. And Jason Blum was like, yeah, I loved this franchise. I loved the ideas, but he sounded very much like a producer then. He was just like, it just didn't make us enough, so we're probably not going to do any more. But who knows, because since then there's been quite an outcry on the internet, because it does have a lot of fans, so they might end up doing another one at some point. But I think, as far as I'm aware, because the second one just bombed, it may not ever get a third chapter anymore, so who knows.
That's a real shame, because I really want to see the hot mess that would be Happy Death Day Part 3.
Like, how would that, because did you guys all see the end, like the end after the credits? Because I didn't see that the first time I watched it, so I was like, what, there's a whole extra bit at the end? Yeah, so like in the end they're picked up by DARPA. Lost reference.
It's very Cube 2 Hypercube, isn't it?
No, that's exactly what it's like though. And then they're like, oh, who can we put in a time loop? Let's put Danielle, who's been the annoying one throughout the entire thing. Let's just chuck her in there. It just seems a bit much.
It was very weird, but I did see that as a good opportunity to get back to some real horror with the third part. The idea that, it's mad that that's what DARPA would want and allow, but the implication by her waking up screaming is that that's what's going to happen. There's a lot of scope for, it's torture, isn't it? Like, that would be really horrific. Deliberately putting someone in it for the purpose of experimentation, and then having them murdered over and over again while you watch, I guess, is the plan. That's horror. That's good horror.
Yeah, it's horrific in theory, isn't it? Although I can't help but think that ending felt like a punchline, right? Didn't it? It felt like a kind of final gag. And even if that was the story of the third one, I think it would very much be taken as a comedy, probably. But I imagine also it would kind of be similar to the setup of this one, where we think we're following a new character, and then they would have found a way to eventually make it about Tree, probably. But I don't know how, because it's like, what more can you do with the character of Tree by this point? But who knows?
She says at the end, like, oh, I'm basically a scientist now because I've got all of these weird equations in my head from dying over and over again. But that's that's one of the other things I quite liked about this. They use the whole, what can you learn if you keep reliving the same day, and what kind of things can you do to better yourself? Like the first one was very much about sort of like personal development, and Tree's like quite unlikable at the start and you really like her by the end because she's grown as a person. This, she's got that, and she's also sort of like dealing with the emotional stuff that she's got going on with her family. But on top of that, she's also becoming like a crazy scientist.
But she's already a med student, right? Because she's in that doctor's class, although he implies in the first one that she's only sort of doing well in the class because she's sleeping with him. But she's not a total dummy, right? She's a bright enough spark.
But doing like quantum mechanics and stuff, that seems like a whole other field.
Yeah, and she's self-deprecating, isn't she, in the second one? She's like, oh, I couldn't possibly do this, and then she does.
I don't know how anyone could be capable of that. Even if you are reliving the same day again and again, like she dies, what, like 11 times or something?
11 times in the first one, yeah. I don't know how many in this one.
Because I don't know whether they ever make it clear. They have that montage of suicides, don't they? But like, I guess you could assume that if she really did it enough time, I mean, this is going to link us to The Endless, isn't it? Because there's that line about if you learn something for 1,000,000 hours, you would become an expert in it, no matter what it is. And I guess you could, if you wanted, think about it as maybe Tree, it was way more times this time that she got stuck in a loop. Maybe it was hundreds of times that she spent repeating that day in the second film. Who knows? Terrifying.
That's the real horror. Like the time loop, I think, is really good for that kind of horror, because being stuck on repeat is a terrifying thing. And all the different like psychological impacts that has on you. Just like, what can you do? You know everything is going to be the same. There's no way to change it. There's quite a good Twilight Zone episode where that kind of thing happens in. So there's one where this guy keeps meeting the same girl again and again, and he's on like a time loop, and he knows everything about this girl, but it's done from the girl's perspective on one of the days, and it suddenly gets very creepy, and they sort of flip it. Yeah, because like he knows everything, and he's fallen in love with her. He's like slept with her already. He knows everything about her. This kind of like knowledge can be very creepy because you know everything about someone you've just met for the first time.
That's great.
Yeah, and that's kind of almost what's happening with Tree and her love interest in this. She knows quite a lot about him by the end, and like they do know each other before, but can you imagine like meeting a stranger? Like in Groundhog Day, he meets that woman who he barely knows, and it does sort of like have that bit where it all gets a bit creepy, but it sort of turns it around in that film. But I think that's another room for like time travel horror to sort of work in.
You're right. And I'm sure it's going to be something we talk about in the next film, isn't it? But it can be a really, really horrific, disturbing content scenario rather. But yeah, I think this film isn't necessary. This film, it can also be used as great comedic effect, can't it? Which this film, I think, goes for more. Look at all of the hilarious different outcomes that could occur, in a montage, because we have the gift of time travel, so we can just keep resetting and putting our characters through ridiculous scenarios and then reset it and do it all over again, kind of thing, which is also great for comedy as much as it is horror, I guess.
That's why all those viral action replay videos go crazy, because like they do the same moment and then they slow it down again, and it's working on the same sort of premise. You want to see similar things happen, but you want to see it more up front, and yeah, it works on that kind of basis as well.
Oh, hey, you're up. Wasn't sure if you wanted to sleep in or not.
I'm so done with this shit.
So basically, being stuck in a time loop is terrifying, right?
Certainly is.
Yes.
Certainly is. So another film which does this in a really interesting way is like one of my favorite films of recent years. It's The Endless from 2017. So let's have a chat about that then.
I was told that they were all going to kill themselves. That's why we left the cult. They sent us a video.
Whoever's watching, I just wanted to say the Ascension is something that we've all been looking forward to. We couldn't be happier.
I want to go back.
So The Endless, I know all of us have seen this movie before because about a year ago you both very, very passionately recommended it to me while we were out for drinks. And I went home and watched it, and it blew me away. And I really enjoyed it. And I recently got the chance to watch. So this is another sequel, as we mentioned. They're both sequels. And we can't really talk about this film without talking about Resolution, the film that came before it, which I've also now seen. I watched that this weekend. I watched 4 movies in preparation for this discussion about 2 movies. I watched the copy that James, you loaned me about a year ago. Thank you.
When we started the podcast, I think I lent you the Endless copy I had. And finally, we've scheduled it in so you can watch it.
You want to know what runs all this? You go find it. Who's next?
So these films are directed by Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, and they've kind of created their own little movie universe that I think Jason Blum would have loved, but they didn't go down that route. It's their own kind of thing. Mike, you've talked to these guys, haven't you? What can you tell us about this film and the universe that they're creating?
Yeah, these guys are so smart. Almost too smart for kind of big mainstream cinema, it feels like. Like I think that they struggle to get big mainstream films made with a high budget because they have these very, very high concept ideas that maybe don't necessarily always sound accessible as mainstream cinema in a way. But they started their career as 2 filmmakers making this small horror film called Resolution, like we talked about. And then they went off and did a couple of other projects. And then they came back and did The Endless, which in itself is its own standalone film. But it does, like you said, Matt, it kind of takes place in the same universe as Resolution. And I think all 3 of us here, right, have we all watched The Endless before Resolution? Because I did. And Matt, you did, right? James, did you watch The Endless first or Resolution?
I saw Resolution first because because me and Mike went to go and watch this at the cinema, and Mike said beforehand on the day, there's a film before it. If you get a chance, you could watch, because this was your second time watching it, I think.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so I rushed to watch Resolution like in the afternoon just before I went to the screening. So I went in knowing that. But I think you're right. You can watch The Endless without having seen Resolution. It just adds an extra sort of like layer of understanding.
You can, but not just understanding, but it makes some scenes a lot more powerful in The Endless because, I mean, ironically, it gives resolution to Resolution, but also shows us that there is no resolution to the characters in Resolution.
Yeah, they're endless. Yeah. I mean, it's an amazing, even the 2 titles and the way they complement each other. I think it's really clever what they've done. And I think, I saw The Endless first and then went back and saw Resolution, and I loved The Endless anyway. But you're right, I think it adds something even more, and it makes that story even more gut-wrenching in a way when you know the characters in Resolution and then you see this followed up in The Endless. It's a really clever thing. And I think, what we just talked about, that feeling of kind of laughing in a way at characters in Happy Death Day being stuck on a loop, and the way in which that's played for laughs, seeing characters stuck in a never-ending hell. This film kind of literally is about that, is about this thing, this kind of Lovecraftian monster enjoying putting these characters, this kind of puppeteer enjoying putting these characters through this never-ending time loop hell for its own entertainment. That's kind of what it feels like. So that feeling that we get watching Happy Death Day, we're kind of confronted with head on, I think, in The Endless, which I think is really interesting.
Because The Endless is centered around 2 brothers which have left a UFO death cult, and then they return later to revisit this death cult for unknown reasons. Basically, the main reason they go back is because they're sent a videotape with one of the people they used to sort of live with, and it's talking about the ascension.
But also Aaron, the younger brother, is having a particularly difficult time getting out of this cult mentally. He never really left, and he really misses it, and he sees it in a really rose-tinted view of his childhood that his older brother Justin just doesn't agree with, and is not the shared recollection between the 2 of them. So there's a bit of Aaron needs to go back to get it out of his system, and that's the real driver, and Justin basically agrees to it. I got the sense that this was a conversation that they'd had many, many times in the years since leaving, and the film is just the time where Justin gives in and says, yeah, okay, we'll go back.
Because this specifically being a UFO death cult as well is like, it's a weird thing to think about, because there's lots of sort of like cultish religions and things like that which have elements of science to them and that kind of thing. Now, I know you did a series on the occult and that kind of stuff, Mike. What kind of stuff did you learn about how cults work, and how does it sort of apply to this film?
Well, it's interesting. I guess there are so many different types, and it's very broad, because actually if you look at the definition of the word occult, it means hidden. And it was anything that was essentially considered a different viewpoint or belief to basically kind of Christian norms. So that is in a lot of ways in films taken as Satanism or pagans or, that kind of cult. But even, back in the day, before we were sort of a bit more enlightened as humans, people that were scientists were often considered occultists. Galileo arguing that the planet was rotating around the sun or whatever was considered, blasphemous and evil and occult and all of that kind of thing. So there is this interesting link between science and the occult, because science is usually kind of opposed in some way to a religious belief, even if you look at the things like evolution versus creationism or whatever it might be. So it's often that, back in the day, a long time ago, scientists were considered occultists in that way. So it's always about people having different non-mainstream beliefs and different non-mainstream customs. And that's a little bit, I don't know, it's more difficult to say that anymore, because everyone has different beliefs and customs, and it's a little bit less, kind of binary, I think, now than it used to be. But generally speaking, it's kind of people that, just don't behave in the normal way and don't believe in the things that we all believe in. And sometimes that's good stuff, sometimes that's bad stuff, and then usually they will be in some sort of cult or group or commune hidden away. Whether it's Satanists next door in Rosemary's Baby or, whatever it might be, it's a kind of hidden group that believe in something else.
Or like the whole tech cult thing going on in devs and all that kind of stuff. There's lots of sort of room for chat about that. But this cult in particular, they don't really seem like a cult, do they? They're on this commune, but there is sort of like this, like you said, the hidden aspect of it. Why are they on this commune? What are they doing? And I think that drives a lot of the horror. What did you guys think about that and sort of like how that aspect of the film worked?
Well, they are pretty culty. The main culty thing is this concept of the ascension, which is, a bit looming and menacing, and it doesn't sound like it's going to be a good end for anybody. And there are like real world cults that they name check and reference in the film that are definite cults. Like Heaven's Gate gets mentioned. They believed that there was like an alien ship hidden behind the Hale-Bopp comet in the tail of that, and if they all killed themselves, they would, I think, ascend and go and be with the aliens. And they talk about drinking the Kool-Aid, which is what the Jonestown people all did. Yeah, and hundreds of people died in that, didn't they? In The Endless, it turns out there's a lot more going on. And I mean, they don't kill themselves, but they are staying there waiting for an inevitable death, aren't they? So there is death coming. And yeah, it's interesting the way it plays out through the film, because you're never quite sure how much of a cult it really is. And obviously there is a mysterious power in the woods. We get that revealed through the course of the film, but we don't quite know how much insanity is at work, I guess, in the people in the group, the commune.
Most of you, this requires no explanation, but we have many traditions here at Camp Arcadia, none more prominent than the struggle. Yeah. Yeah. Woo! We have the struggle with passion, the struggle with growth, the struggle with the higher power.
So where does the time travel come in with this film then? Because I think it's so fascinating the way these guys have put this together in the film, and the way they've expanded it in their sort of like their other films like Resolution. Synchronic has a lot of elements of this kind of stuff. I think the red flower that's in this one gets checked in that film. So the time travel, how did you guys feel about that? And the weird way that they've set up the time loops, because I don't think I've seen this in another film, the way they've sort of sectioned them off into proper spaces as opposed to just something that's happening to people.
I think, yeah, like what's really fascinating about this film is that you start off not knowing you're watching a time loop film at all. Like you guys just said, this film sets itself up as a creepy cult commune vibe. You think you're going to watch a film that is like Jonestown-esque kind of horror film. And then suddenly these characters, I think it's Justin's character, wanders off and comes across all of these other strange characters in the woods that are all in their own little time pockets. They're in their own little loops that are at different lengths. And it brings about interesting questions that our main commune characters seem to be in a loop that lasts about 10 years. And to them, that is almost like a kind of heaven. It's like you can stay forever young and healthy. You can live your best life for 10 years and then you can repeat it again. And to them, that's a really positive thing that makes them worship this thing controlling it like it's a god, like it's a deity. And then elsewhere, you've got people that it's the opposite. It's like they're in a hell. You've got one guy that seems to be on a kind of 3-hour loop where he hangs himself, and he's Shitty Carl, isn't it? Shitty Carl. He's in like a 3-hour loop, which in itself sounds absolutely horrific. But then they come across another character which seems to be in a loop that lasts about 3 seconds, where he's sitting in a chair, he runs forward and smashes his head against a wall, and a record is skipping, and that's all it is over and over again for eternity, which is pretty much the most horrific thing you can possibly imagine. So yeah, it uses time travel as a way to show the best parts of it and the absolute worst parts of it, I suppose. Which, yeah, you're right. You don't see that often in films where people are all stuck in their own little loops that are all different lengths.
And before, in Happy Death Day to You, we were talking about the sort of the potential for horror, and that films have to make a choice whether or not to go down that route. I did think it was interesting that in The Endless, that guy in the tent that's only got a few seconds in his loop, we the audience see him before any characters see him. So Justin goes out of the camp and has this weird experience, and then we just get shown the tent where something awful is happening. You can hear this crunching, repeating sound, but Justin doesn't see that. Aaron's going to stumble upon it much later in the film, but it was kind of like a deliberate thing to kind of set out their stall of like, no, we're doing horror with it, and we're really going horrific, and this is the most horrific time loop, and we're just going to show it to you as early as possible.
And also, I think it brings about really interesting questions that I didn't notice first time round, but more and more the more I watch it, that what we're seeing, it feels like throughout the bulk of the film, is the point of view of this monster, right? Like you have a lot of images. The camera is strange. I don't know if you've noticed, it almost looks like a kind of fisheye lens. And the camera sort of roams around a lot, and it goes through the woods and it follows characters. And there are moments when characters look directly down the camera lens. The camera goes up in the air and looks down on them, and they look up, you know. And obviously there's that whole repeating thing where the monster is sending them footage, tapes of themselves. And when they see it, it's basically the footage we've previously seen. So it's like this... It's like we are this Lovecraftian monster, isn't it? It feels like it's a film that's reckoning with horror films in a way, that people that enjoy watching characters suffer for their own entertainment. And it's like those characters are aware they're in a horror film that are suffering for something's entertainment. And I think that is a really interesting thing, that, yeah, the camera suddenly just like leaves our two main characters for a bit and then just roams off and shows us this other stuff happening and sort of teases it.
Yeah, I hadn't clocked that idea that it's almost like a stand-in POV for the monster or the alien or whatever. But that slots in nicely, like you said, with the kind of deconstruction of what it's doing. I noticed that as well in the first film. They do it a bit differently in Resolution, where rather than doing those camera tricks, there's a lot more focus on the photographs and the videos and showing the characters themselves, and it got me thinking about like the relationship between the writer and director and the characters that they are voluntarily killing. So in Resolution, I thought there was this idea that the monster was kind of like playing director and showing them footage of themselves in order to create these stories. Because that's a really interesting dimension of the monster as well, isn't it? It's not just messing with them, and it's not just toying with them. Several characters say in both films it wants stories. It wants to see a story play out with a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's that moment at the end of Resolution, I think, isn't there, when the two characters look up at the monster and they say, "Can we try it a different way?" or something like that. They say at the end, don't they? And yeah, there is this feeling that they have to play out their narratives in order to survive this.
And then they're played that clip, "Can we try it a different way?" in The Endless, and is it Mike, the guy who's trying to help Chris? Or one of the two guys from Resolution just says, "Oh, I guess that didn't work then." And they've just got to like plug on and try a different storyline, a different plot, whatever it is. And they don't know how to, a lot of the characters assume that telling the best story is the answer to escaping these time prisons. I'm not convinced they're right. I think the monster will keep going forever.
Don't stay here. You can't help. Just leave before.
Well, it's so self-referential, isn't it? Because when you're watching a film, you're basically watching a time loop. You're watching it again and again. And you as the audience are watching that and you want a different story. You want this. Like when we were talking about Happy Death Day just now.
Yeah.
Yeah, we said if they did it like this, we would like that. So it's basically, it's so clever because it works on that level, but then it also works on that narrative level where it makes sense that it's just this mysterious monster or creature sort of like watching them all. But yeah, it's very clever with that aspect.
So are they saying there's something inherently cruel in being the filmmaker that has the power to make those decisions over the characters? So we're saying, "Oh, we would want this, we want it to be like this," but the audience don't have any control like that. Is there something gross and horrible and like a disgusting, scary Lovecraft god-like power that when you're in the role of a writer-director, you get to make those choices?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what this film is doing. And it's probably also no coincidence that the two writers and directors have also cast themselves in it as well, because I feel like it's so much about them telling this story in a way. And yeah, I think it's like, it's been done in sort of various different ways. I think the biggest, most sort of mainstream version of this in a horror film is probably The Cabin in the Woods as well. This idea that there are these big godlike monsters lurking underground and they demand a sacrifice, and this sacrifice has to be horror characters being killed off in order to please them. And it kind of is almost the same kind of concept, but Cabin in the Woods is done in some ways in a much more accessible and less challenging way, although I love that film. But it's that same idea, I think, that makes people reckon with, what are we doing? If me as a horror fan, I sit and put on every day, or I could rewatch the film Scream over and over again, and it's posing that question of, like, what if that character could actually feel and was actually alive, and you were making them get killed and suffer over and over and over again for your entertainment? It's a really cool concept, I think.
Yeah, it's also like I like the fact that it works on that other level as well. Like, obviously, it's got all of that clever stuff with sort of like the audience director comparisons. But when I watched it, obviously, as a sci-fi fan, this time round, I didn't think of the monster as a deity or anything like that. I saw it as an alien. Like, it's a UFO death cult, he calls it. And it's got a lot of links to sort of like alien abductions. And this idea that this thing is trying to work out how these creatures work and how to sort of like play around with them. And they're in like time domes, which could look like Petri dishes. If this thing is above them looking down, it's sort of like doing its little experiments, finding out what's working and what's not. And it's sort of like got that sort of sci-fi aspect to it as well. So you can read it like that, and you can read it with this whole other level, which makes it so clever.
Yeah, I wondered what you guys thought about that actually, because this, in some ways, I was even thinking how much would you consider this sci-fi? Because yes, it's about time loops, but in some ways, it's not about the technology or science, right? It's just about a monster. It's about, yeah, I guess it could be an alien, but you also don't really know what it is. It's magic that's causing this, right, rather than science.
We've talked about this a bit before, that time travel films can be only tentatively sci-fi because you can throw some sci-fi tropes at a time travel film and it becomes a sci-fi movie, but time travel can also happen by magical reasons or bonk on the head, as we've seen and enjoyed. There's all these other different ways you can go about it. But I mean, The Endless does specifically talk about it being a UFO death cult, but then we're sort of revealed that might just be like Justin's spin on it because he doesn't like it, and there's negative connotations to a UFO death cult. And also it does start with a Lovecraft quote on screen, and Lovecraft is not really sci-fi. They're not aliens, are they? They're like interdimensional god beings, and again, it's just another example of something that is not, it's got a foot in the fantasy camp very firmly, as well as the sci-fi camp.
Yeah, because I was going to pose to you the question, exactly like how you said, is it sci-fi? Is this horror in the same way that you would expect it to be? Like, when I watched it again, obviously knowing sort of like more about it, does it work? How like, obviously we talked about the way it does work as a horror, but what specific elements make this a horror film, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's not your traditional horror film in the way that Happy Death Day is, the original Happy Death Day, right? Where you've got jump scares and killers and murder. This is very low key, and I think it's more, again, it's horror in its ideas more than anything else. It's the idea of it. Again, it's the thought of being stuck on a loop. There's this feeling of dread, I think. There's this feeling of, there's just this palpable atmosphere of dread, like something really awful is happening. And again, this is very Lovecraftian. Lovecraft wrote a lot about this idea of this evil or this monster lurking like just in worlds just beyond our reach and just beyond our comprehension. Like we can't quite comprehend or explain or understand what these evils are. And I think this has that Lovecraftian horror where there's nothing explicit really that horrific happening, because there isn't a death cult or anything like that, and we don't even really see this monster, but there is this feeling throughout the whole film, I think, that there is something present, there's something lurking that is evil and not human, that is causing these time loops, that is controlling these people, that is puppeteering the whole thing. And that in itself is very frightening, and it kind of adds just a layer of suspense just underneath, like bubbling under the surface of the whole film. But you're right, in some ways also, I could see a lot of people arguing that this isn't horror at all. It's because it's not got loads of jump scares or anything like that, and it's not got that traditional horror.
I think the filmmakers are quite proud of the fact that they don't do jump scares. I watched some of the special features, particularly on the Resolution Blu-ray, where they just make a point, they state it, and I don't think they would be stating the fact that they haven't put jump scares in it unless that was quite important to what they were trying to do. But then again, there is the constant threat of a violent death to all of the characters in terms of like horrible things happening to them. Shitty Carl lays it out quite clearly that you can either hang yourself and then just be a hanging corpse that you have to look at in your next loop, or the thing in the woods is going to do something much worse to you, and we never see what it does to you, but we are told it is worse than suicide.
Exactly. It's just that constant threat, like running all the way pretty much from beginning to end, which is definitely there. Yeah,
so I think it does have, like, it's got all of those elements, and I think it is sort of like as layered in sci-fi as well, in terms of sort of like the what if and the unknown and trying to unravel that, because that's such a core feature of science fiction films. You're trying to figure out what's going on and how you can solve it. Obviously there's no sort of like resolution, excuse the pun for the first film, but it's sort of like it's got that, and like the main core of it is still that sort of time loop aspect, right?
And also that quite big, again, that sort of philosophical idea that I would consider, that I link with sci-fi, which is that, again, that choice that they have to make. You know, you could live on this commune, which it turns out is actually a fairly nice bunch of people, fairly harmless. Would you live in this world where, particularly for Aaron's character, it's almost this perfect existence of just hanging out, drinking beer and smoking that red flower and just being all loved up and happy forever, and have that kind of predictable loop where it's always the same? Or do you want to take the risk at breaking out of that loop and going and living in the real world and getting a job as a cleaner and struggling for money and doing all the things that they've struggled with, but it's more of a authentic, real world, I suppose, and not just that repetition? Because
in the cult, their sort of like prize for staying there and staying in the time loop is time. They can be young forever, and they don't say 10,000 hours like we mentioned earlier. They say like 10 million hours, and I think that's really important, because normally you'd say 10,000 hours because that's achievable potentially in a lifetime. So there's this thing that they've had all this extra time, but they still haven't got to where they want to be. And there's a moment which I didn't quite get the first time round, but you know when they're around by the campfire and there's the guy with the beard who is always by the cabin with the lock.
Tim.
So so Tim's drinking a beer and he's brewed this beer. And obviously his thing is trying to brew the perfect beer. And he's just doing it again and again. But he's like disgusted by it. It's still not perfection. So he's got all this extra time, but he still can't be good enough to do what he wants. So he still hasn't reached that perfection because it's unattainable. No matter how much time you get, you might never get there. The guy's got his equation on the wall. He can't figure it out. And the other guy's trying to do magic and stuff. There's still that sort of like, however much time you have, you might never get that perfection that you're after.
And the guy can't do convincing magic tricks without getting help from the monster in the sky. I didn't clock that. That is a really good point.
It's terrifying. And again, that's horrible, isn't it? It's like what people say is the definition of insanity, isn't it? Of repeating the same thing and expecting different results, but never getting it, kind of thing, which is essentially what they've all got. Yeah, it's pretty horrible. Did you guys have any trouble figuring out, like, because I remember when I first watched it going, okay, so if they're on, how come they haven't aged and these characters have, and them saying about, they drop in all of these little things to, I think, confuse you or make you think about it, because there's that line when Justin says to Aaron, oh, that girl, you know, the woman that's sort of flirting with Aaron, they're like, yeah, she was a bit weird even when you were a kid. And he makes a comment that she's almost could be like a paedophile. And that was making my brain go the first time I watched it, thinking, oh, is it that Aaron and Justin have been on some sort of loop and she remembers him as an adult and that's why she's attracted to him when he's a little boy, because he's reset and maybe they are actually on a bigger loop than everyone else or something like that. But again, it's kind of never made completely clear.
That's absolutely where I thought the film was going the first time I saw it, especially, you know, when they get reunited in the desert and they are just trying to get back to, I think they're trying to get back to Shitty Carl first, and then they're going to go back to the camp. At that point in the film, particularly the way that Aaron kind of appears through one of those barriers and just pops into reality, and the way they're talking to each other in such a relaxed way after everything that's happened at that point in the film, I thought, oh, are we already in a reset, and the film's going to end with them escaping? But then no, it's like, no, they said they were young when they escaped. It's been 10 years. Yeah, I felt the same way. I didn't know what was going on. And they do drop in those confusing points. Because also, Justin says at the start, like, no, everyone here's in like their 40s. They just look good because they eat healthy.
Yeah.
He hasn't clocked the time loops.
And the other thing that confused me initially as well is that, you know, this idea of them learning and repeating stuff, because part of me was like, but when they reset, do their memories reset? Because when we see Mike and what's the other guy, the junkie guy?
Chris,
Mike and Chris. They have that thing where they start off and they go, Mike, oh my God, it's you. You know, like they have that kind of, they reset their scenario and they say that same opening line every time, like they've forgotten.
And they're both annoyed. They're both annoyed at each other's opening lines. They're saying, I can't hear you say that one more time. I'm going to kill myself. But then it's like, but you still say your line. You know, they're playing the roles. They have to play the roles at first. At what point in your loop are you, do you gain autonomy again?
When I asked the two guys about it, I asked them that and they said, yeah, they said that's the thing that confuses everyone the most. But they said you do have a memory. You do know exactly that you're in a loop, and those two doing that they are acting out theatrics. They are performing the story in order to satisfy the monsters to try and get out of it, essentially, because they think that they've got to tell the story that the monsters want them to tell in order to be set free, maybe. So they are doing it as a kind of, they're acting, essentially, because they know that's how their story starts. But they do know that they don't want to say it.
So they're convinced about the beginning of the story, and then in their 7-day loop, Mike and Chris, they think they're going to get the right clues from the hard drives and the film reels that will reveal the correct middle and end to the story. Is that what's going on with them? But they're convinced about the beginning.
Yes, like I think Chris makes a reference to it almost being like solving a Rubik's Cube. Like they're trying to figure out the exact right combination of actions that will lead them to escape, I think. Yeah, at least that's what they think.
They're trying to do it like they did in Groundhog-Day. They're trying to find that perfect bit where they're friends with everyone, and they like, just like Bill Murray, and he's sort of like made friends with everyone in the town, and then suddenly he can get out of the loop. But it doesn't look like there is that kind of resolution for them.
I don't understand what's going on at that camp.
Bunch of looping prisons, man. Like shitty pods of time. Repeating over and over and over again like rats, telling stories for that thing's amusement.
The other thing I wondered about is so they always get reset at a certain place, like a certain space in their loop. So when you add someone else into that loop, what happens to them? And sort of like, where do they come in?
Well, I got the impression that there was no adding people into a loop.
But there is, because the woman who is in Resolution ends up joining the cult, and she says she used to be in a psychiatric ward, and also the cult's been going for like years and years and years, like hundreds of years from the looks of it.
Well, it depends how long she's been with them and how many loops she's been with them, and whether it's more than 10 years for her. I was thinking it was more like if you go into that area of land, you know, this rural place that this monster has domain over, it's going to pick a circle for you, and that's your loop. I was thinking it was more like Aaron couldn't go into the 10-year loop. At best, he would be in a different loop, you know, that intersects with theirs, maybe. I don't know. What did you think, Mike?
I think it is like I think they talk about it at one point, that essentially if you are inside the space, when it resets, you're stuck. So that's why there's that race to get out. They literally have to race and get through the barrier before the ascension. So if they were still in there, if they'd waited another 2 minutes and they had been inside that dome, the Big 10 loop one, when it resets, they would be part of that loop forever. So there's a moment when he goes up to the small cabin, the tiny one where the guy's hitting his head against the wall, and the guy who's hitting his head says, "Get back, get away." Because if he had stepped inside that cabin, he'd be stuck on that 3-second loop.
But Aaron is inside the ring of poles. That's what confused me about that. Aaron goes up to the edge of the tent, but the tent has these rock sticks that are everywhere and mark out the circles. They're outside the tent. He goes past them to look at the tent. So he's I thought he was within the 6-second circle. And obviously he witnesses that loop several times over. But you were saying it was actually more confined than that. It was just the tent, and he would have broken the... But then they go into Shitty Carl's loop.
That's the thing that confuses me a bit, is the Shitty Carl one, because all I can assume is that he is not inside the boundary quite when they reset. Because I'm sure it is... I think it's Shitty Carl himself that says if you're in that dome when it resets, you're done for, basically. And I can only assume that he stood just outside it, and that's why he didn't get stuck in, because I'm sure that's what the law is, that if you're inside it when it resets, then that's it for you, kind of thing.
My take on what Carl was saying was that, like, if you're inside, like, the monster's creating a circle for you, and if you're inside that circle at this point of ascension, that's your loop. So you can't get caught in mine when mine restarts, because I'm already stuck in this prison that it's created for me. That was what maybe I took it too far in my head, but like, I thought the monster's creating a time limit, a timer for you, and has marked out a circle for you, and you've got to get out of it before it resets your new loop. You can't join Shitty Carl's loop.
The only thing I wondered about as well is, so Aaron and Justin join the cult when their mum dies, and they end up in that sort of like in the commune then, and they grow up there, then they leave, and then they come back. I don't think this would be the case. I think they would just be back at the age they are when the loop starts. But I had a thought, like maybe it will start again, and then there'll be kids, and then they'd grow up, and then it would be that time period again. But I think that's thinking too much into it, as always with these time travel things.
I think that seed is dropped for you to think that, definitely. Like I that's what, like we were saying about the reference, that the fact that the woman fancies Aaron even when he was a little boy suggested to me that maybe she had a memory of him being older, and she knew about that maybe they were in like a 30-year loop or something. But I think
they could be in a 30-year loop with an absolutely enormous radius stretching out to the city. They still could be at the end of the film.
Yeah, well, there is that feeling that when they drive out of their little dome, you still see in the sky the weird sort of circling birds, and you think, oh, it leaves you with that ambiguous feeling of like, oh, maybe they're still in there. It's like the spinning top in Inception, isn't it? I think it kind of dangles that in a little way. But I think technically what happened is, because I had to ask the directors about this as well, because it's very specific, because what happened is they were picked up from that car crash as little boys, and they spent nearly 10 years in that commune, but then Justin broke him and Aaron out right before the reset happened.
Last ascension, yeah.
So that they weren't stuck in a loop. Then they spent 10 years away from it, and then came back just before the next restart happened. So both times they've escaped just before a reset. So they've just escaped being trapped both times, kind of thing. Yeah.
And I suppose you would, if they're talking about ascensions and things like that, you'd be a bit like, yeah, I better get out of here now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's so, what a clever film.
So good. The other thing I really liked about this is just how much detail they go into sort of like the look of it, and the way everything looks like a different time period, because you've got the commune and everyone's sort of like dressed in that sort of dated fashion. And then you've got the tent with that guy who's clearly got the sundial outside. He's from a different time period. And then it goes even further back with all these weird statues that they come across. And it's like, how long has this been going on for? And how many other people are caught in these weird loops all around? Like, how far back does it go? And it's just, that really brought the sort of time travel concept to me. It made it sort of a lot more expansive, because just like that really opens up just how long this experiment thing's been going on for.
It's brilliant. It's so cool. And just going back to that idea of that sort of meta level, that it's these two filmmakers that are like, yes, we started with this tiny little debut film about these two guys in a cabin, but look at all the other stories we have in our head. And it's almost like within this world, we've got hundreds of other domes. We've got hundreds of other ideas and hundreds of other stories going on just outside of this one, kind of thing. And it's, yeah, I just think it's such a clever idea.
All right, Mike. Well, thank you so much for joining us and helping us try and work our way through these riddles of movies. Just once more, for the tiny subset of our audience who might not know who you are, where can people find you online and find your show?
Thank you for having me. So they can find The Evolution of Horror in all the places where you usually get podcasts, and you could follow us on Twitter at EvolutionPod for any more information.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Journey Through Sci-Fi, and on all your favourite social media websites. If you just search for us, you can get in touch with us.
Yeah, so come and join in on the discussion. Thanks again, Mike, for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always. Next time on the podcast, we'll be expanding on our look at time travel and other genres. So we're going to look into sort of like how it fits into sort of like the romance genre and the comedy genre. So we'll be further exploring that as we go on. That's about it from us today. We'll see you again next time.